I want to talk about cross-site scripting today, which is kind of this, it's probably the vulnerability most people started with, and it's been known for, I don't know, since for ages. But there's still kind of new issues coming up. So I guess, I hope everyone knows what cross-site scripting is. Like, the general idea is we're somehow able, as an attacker, to execute JavaScript on a web page that is not our own in the browser of the victim. And technically, that's called the origin of another web page. One thing how to think about this is that JavaScript in a browser always comes via HTML. So we cannot execute pure JavaScript. The browser will not do anything with it. So there are different ways how to do this. Like, we can have a script tag and execute something. We can load a script from somewhere else. Or we can have these event handlers. But what all of this has in common is we have some HTML code that is either including or referencing JavaScript. So really, the way to think about XSS is not JavaScript injection, it's HTML injection. JavaScript is essentially just the thing we use later to make this a security vulnerability, to exploit things. But really what we're talking about is HTML injection. And usually how this happens is that we have an HTML document which has some dynamic content that we control. So this is a very simple example. We have some HTML, and then we have some PHP code in there that is echoing a variable, and that variable is a get variable. This is attacker controlled. So that's basically the textbook example of reflected cross-site scripting. So that is kind of the common cross-site scripting, where we have an HTML document, and then there's some data in it that's dynamically included that the attacker can control. But there's another way how to do cross-site scripting, and that is if we can convince the server to deliver a whole document as HTML, then we also have cross-site scripting, because the document is delivered from the server we want to attack, so it's in its origin. Which I'd like to call file upload XSS. What's important here is how does the browser actually decide what's an HTML document? Like, when does it render HTML? And the way the browser usually does this is that there's a header sent. If you do a HTTP request, it sends a header. It says content type, and this has to be text HTML, or can also be text XML, but it has to be a header where the browser knows this can contain HTML code. So if we look at this content type header, content types that can lead to cross-site scripting are text HTML, text XML, or application XML. XML because, like, a while ago people had this idea we should have kind of strict XML for HTML. It didn't really succeed, but that kind of means you can still render HTML within an XML document. And then we have these other content types like text plain or image JPEG, application octet stream, or also we can have some bogus content type, like, which makes no sense at all, but all of these the browser will usually not render as HTML. Usually there are some exceptions, but I'll get to that later. So now let's look at an attack. This is something that that wasn't found by me. That was found by Franz Rosen. I guess many of you know him. He found a cross-site scripting in an implementation of ACME. ACME is the protocol used by Let's Encrypt to validate that you own a domain when you want to get a certificate. And one step in that validation is that on your server, you have to put a file that's named after a token. So it's basically a hex number. And then the response must be that token plus another token. What these tokens are doesn't matter for us right now. It's some cryptographic thing. But what you can see here is that, OK, we have something in the request that ends up in the response. And there are some implementations that implement this as simply reflecting that. There's, from the protocol side, a reason why this is in some situations simpler. You can kind of implement this in a stateless way. So there are some server implementations that if you send a request to this URL, you will get back what's in that part of the URL. So yeah, this looks like a classic reflected cross-site scripting attack. Except that this, what comes back there is not really an HTML document. It's a text document. So it shouldn't have this content type HTML header. However, this is a quote from the blog post I showed you earlier. It says, yeah, there's an old mod to Apache called Magic MIME that tries to figure out the content type depending on the first bytes of the response. For example, B would lead to content type text HTML. What that means is, like, if you put some HTML in there, then the server will guess the type based on the content and send it as a content type text HTML. So this doesn't sound good. And when I read this, basically this was the starting point where I started looking into this and thought, OK, there are probably more problems with that than just this single vulnerability. So what's this Apache module? Apache mod MIME-magic. I'd like to call it a module that enables XSS attacks. It introduces MIME-sniffing. So what it does is, here's the documentation. This module determines the MIME type of files in the same way the Unix file command works. It looks at the first few bytes of the file. So it checks what's in that file. And if something looks familiar, it tries to kind of guess what kind of file that is. It already mentions the Unix file command here. So the code is an old fork of this file utility. That happened somewhere in the 90s. If you read, OK, some 90s C code is parsing files. It's probably complex parsing. Doesn't sound good. You usually think, yeah, there are probably buffer overflows in there, memory corruption vulnerabilities. I haven't found any, but also the code was not very friendly to testing. If someone wants to look into this, I can only encourage that. But also we have other problems with that. Yeah. So if we have an Apache server with this mod MIME-magic module, what it does actually is, if it serves a file, it first checks the file extension. If that file extension is in the etc MIME types file and has a content type registered there, then it will use that. And if not, it will try to guess it based on its content. So what that means is, if we have a web application that allows us to upload files with a file type that's kind of unusual, that's not registered in this global MIME types configuration, then this leads to a cross-site scripting attack. Because we can upload HTML with this unusual extension, Apache will not be able to determine the content type based on the extension. We'll try to auto-detect it with this mod MIME-magic, and we'll set the HTML content type. What's this etc MIME types file? So that's basically a standard thing under all Unix systems. So it's a simple text file which has a MIME type on the left, file extensions on the right. So these are For HTML, that looks like okay, .htm, .html, and .shtml. I don't know what that is, but they all should get served with the text HTML MIME type. Similar for JPEG, but also we have all kinds of very unusual file types. I don't know what IGS is, but it also has a MIME type registered there. What's unfortunate about this file is it's not standardized at all. So basically, every Linux distribution maintains their own copy of that file, and when they think, okay, we need a new MIME type, we add it to that file, but it's not standardized, so you cannot really rely on anything in there. They are completely different among different Linux distributions. Okay, so this mod-my-magic module is dangerous, so probably we should just disable it. Good idea, but if you're in shared hosting, you cannot really do that because it's, for example, not possible to disable this in an htaccess configuration file or per virtual host. You can only disable it for the whole web server. It's kind of either on or off. So if you're a customer of a shared hosting provider and they have it enabled, there's nothing you can do. But if we disable it, then we're kind of good, right? Well, unfortunately not. Because what happens if the web server cannot identify the MIME type, like it cannot identify it based on the MIME types file, and we have disabled mod-my-magic, so it doesn't try to guess it. It will just send the file without a content type header. And then there's the browser, and browsers also do MIME sniffing. And there's even a standard for that. But that there's a standard doesn't mean that browsers do what's written in the standard or that it's consistent. But still, the browser will also do MIME sniffing. If the browser sees a file without a type, without a content type, it will try to guess based on its content what it is. And if there's HTML code in it, it will try to render it. Yeah, so if you send HTML, that's what I just said. So basically, the same attack works just as well without this mod-my-magic module. But some of you might say, yeah, but there's this security header. Like I don't know, there are these web pages where you can check if your website sends all these fancy security headers, and then you get a nice green A. And one of them is this X content type options nosniff. With this, we can disable MIME sniffing in the browser. Here's the documentation from Mozilla Developer Networks. It says, yeah, the X content type options response HTTP header is a marker used by the server to indicate that the MIME types advertised in the content type headers should not be changed and be followed. This allows to opt out of MIME type sniffing. Sounds good, right? Exactly what we want. We don't want to have these risks from MIME sniffing. Or in other words, it's a way to say that the webmasters knew what they were doing. Okay, sounds good. We can set this X content type options nosniff, and then we are safe from these attacks. Wait, no, not so fast. We have to read the fine print here. If we continue reading on that web page, at some point it says, note, nosniff only applies to script and style types. Also, applying nosniff to images turned out to be incompatible with existing websites. So, okay, it tells us it applies to script and style files. It doesn't apply to images, but it doesn't say anything about the direct navigation, like if we're directly opening that file. It doesn't say anything about HTML. It's actually wildly inconsistent between browsers how this behaves if you have a direct navigation. In Chrome, it will display a file as text. In Safari, it will try to download it. And in both Firefox and Edge, it will sniff the MIME type and it will render HTML if there's HTML in it, despite the nosniff header. That I found very interesting because this seems to be the most dangerous form of MIME-sniffing. But then there's this header which many people are using and think that this disables MIME-sniffing. But at least in 2 browsers, it doesn't do what you expect it to do. Yeah, so in both Firefox and Edge, HTML will be sniffed despite content type options nosniff. Mozilla, they kind of accept that this should be considered a bug. They said they wanted to fix it, but it hasn't happened yet. So there's an open bug, but yeah. Microsoft, when I reported this, they told me, yeah, we have completed our investigation and the behavior that we reported has minimal impact and therefore does not meet our bar for servicing at this time. I guess it's a friendly way of saying we don't care. What I assume is, I mean, Microsoft Edge is kind of dead. They want to move to the Chrome code base, and then it will probably be fixed by that, so maybe it's fine. Yeah. OK, but if we take this together, that means if we have a web application that allows uploads of unusual file types that are not in the MIME types file, and the web server has this mod MIME-magic, or is another web server that does the same thing, or if the web application is not setting this content type options nosniff header, or if our browser is Firefox or Edge, then we have cross-site scripting. OK, and so that you believe me that I didn't just make that up and it never happens for real, here's an example, WordPress, the most famous content management system. If you have an author permission in WordPress, which kind of means you're allowed to write stuff on the web page, it shouldn't mean that you're allowed to execute JavaScript and steal the administrator's account. Then you can upload media files. And what's a media file in WordPress? Looking at the code, this is all what WordPress considers to be a media file. Plenty of file extensions. The one that I figured out was most interesting for us was the 3G2 file extension. It seems to be some ancient video format that was used by mobile phones in the past. I think I've never seen such a file in the wild, but you can upload it to a WordPress blog. The nice thing about this 3G2 is that on Debian and Ubuntu, which is very common on servers for hosting, this extension is not in the MIME types file. So there's another barrier we need here. So WordPress is trying to be smart. It is by itself trying to detect the type of a file you upload. And if it doesn't match what it expects, then it will not be accepted. But if it cannot detect the file type, then it will be accepted. So yeah. So we need to create a file that libmagic, which is kind of the backend library to detect file types used by PHP and then used by WordPress, will not identify as a valid file type, but the browser will identify it as HTML. I haven't managed to do it for Chrome, but this works in Firefox. So we have a simple cross-site scripting vector. So if you haven't seen this before, this basically we're loading an image, but we put some garbage value in there, and then we have a handler on error where we can put our code. And because this is not a valid image, it cannot be loaded, so the code will be executed. And then this bracket, exclamation mark, dash thing, that is an HTML comment. And that is one of the ways how you can convince a browser that this is HTML. So this is just there, so the browser will see that this is HTML code. And then we put some binary garbage there. The reason for that is if we don't do that, then libmagic will think this is a text document or an HTML document. I played around with it a while. And if you put some binary garbage there, then it will not identify it as anything. But the browser will, in Firefox will. So I have a demo for that. So here's our exploit. That what you just saw, plus some that's just output of def urandom. And we have a WordPress block here. And we have a user, Alice, and Alice is an author on this blog. So she's allowed to create posts, and she's allowed to add media files. Oh, unfortunately, I have forgotten to delete the previous test. OK, so we add a new file. This is our exploit with extension 3G2. And we open it. OK, and then here it tells us where it got uploaded, the URL. And if we open that, we can execute JavaScript. Yep. I reported this in September last year. It's still not fixed. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to say. I announced that I will disclose it, so yeah. Next example is Mailman and Pipermail. So Mailman is kind of the standard software for mailing lists. I mean, I know mailing lists are kind of 90s thing, but there are still people using mailing lists. Not everyone has moved to Slack. And Mailman 2, like Mailman 2 is the version that everyone's using. There's also Mailman 3, but I think almost nobody's using that. So Mailman 2, it comes with a tool called Pipermail that is used to create the mailing list archives. And what does this do with attachments? If you have a mail with an unknown extension or with no extension, it will rename it to attachment.obj. OK. Mailman also tries to detect if there's HTML in it and will not do that, will remove the attachment, but the same bypass that worked for WordPress works here as well. It's using the same code in the backend. OK, what's an OBJ extension? It's not in the MIME types file on any major distribution. In Gentoo, it is in the MIME types file. It's actually a TGIF file, which seems to be some image format. So if you're using Gentoo, you're safe from this. But on all the other, I actually have a Mailman installation on a Gentoo server. So. But on all the mainstream Linux distributions, this is dangerous. So this means we have a cross-site scripting for pretty much all Mailman mailing lists with a public archive. They changed the default extension from OBJ to bin. So in the past, this was kind of configurable. You could have either or, but OBJ was the default. They changed the default. But they have not made a release with that fix yet. And we also have a demo here. So we have a mailing list here, which is called Happy List. And it has a public archive. And we have Alice again. And Alice is a member of that mailing list. And we'll send an email to that list. Yep. Hello from SecurityFest. It's really nice in Gothenburg. And we add an attachment. The content of that attachment is the same as we had before with WordPress, but now we have one without an extension. It's just a file. It's called exploit no extension. Upload and send. OK, and then yeah. Here is the public archive. Hello from SecurityFest, and here's an attachment to that mail. and it will execute XSS. Okay. So I found more vulnerable applications in Joomla. It worked with XCF files on Fedora. I mean, as you see, it's always kind of dependent on the Linux distribution whether it's vulnerable. They somewhat mitigated that, although it only works on new installations. Otherwise, you have to copy some stuff in your htaccess file. So how they try to fix it is that for all the file types they have allowed by default, they will force the MIME type by setting it in the htaccess configuration. And they also changed it that they will set a default MIME type for all the other file extensions. And they also set the nosniff header, which only works in some browsers, as we learned earlier. And also a software called Vanilla Forum. This allowed uploading of FLA files, and they are not in any distributions MIME types. Also still unfixed. Okay. What can we do about this? You might think, can we prevent these attacks if we always send a MIME type? So if we tell our web server, if you cannot identify the type of that file based on the extension, maybe just send it as text plain, because that should be safe. So yeah, let's set a safe MIME type for all the unknown files. Apache, if you Google for that for Apache, you will find that there's a directive default type for the configuration. However, it has been removed in Apache 2.4. So why is that? I thought, like, yeah, that's exactly the option I need. Then I'm safe from this attack, and it's been removed. There's a document called W3C Standard Authoritative Metadata, which I would like to call a standard to enable cross-site scripting attacks. So it says here, yeah, server software designers should not specify default representation metadata such as media type, character encoding, or content language within the standard configuration shipped with the server. Instead of specifying a default for metadata, it's better for representations to be sent without that metadata. This allows the recipient to guess the metadata instead of being forced to either accept the metadata or being tempted. So it's basically saying you should do exactly that, which will lead to the cross-site scripting attack. And the same thing, yes, if you're so the first thing basically says it shouldn't be the default, and the second thing is if you're administering a server, you shouldn't do that. It gets even crazier. Earlier versions of Apache did send a default content type. They sent text plain. And the MIME-sniffing standard for browsers says that browsers should try to detect if this is an Apache server sending the default MIME type. And then they should ignore it. Yeah. So yeah, setting a default MIME type would prevent these attacks, but it seems people writing standards really don't like it. Yeah. Nginx does send a default MIME type. It's application octet stream, which basically just says binary data and it will be downloaded. Yeah. This is secure, but it's against the standards. So yeah. Then a few more things. File extensions. So we learned earlier, usually a web server decides based on the file extension what MIME type to use. Here's some PHP code, and I'd like to ask you if you think that this is safe from cross-site scripting. So, specifically cross-site scripting, because I know there could be directory traversal due to the file name. That's not what I'm looking at. But what we're doing here is we're basically checking the file extension. If it's JPEG, PNG, or GIF, then it's OK. If not, we set an error. And if it's OK, we will move this file to the uploaded files directory. So who thinks this is not safe? Can anyone tell me why it's not safe? Yeah, OK. So What about if we have a file that's named .jpeg without anything in front? It's kind of just a file extension. What is the file extension here? Opinions? No file extension, says someone. So the interesting thing is PHP and Apache disagree on that. So PHP says in the documentation, if the base name of the path starts with a dot, the following characters are interpreted as extension and the file name is empty. Okay, so it says it's an empty file name with the extension .jpg. Apache says leading docs are considered to be part of the base name. A file named .png is likely not a PNG file, but just a hidden file called PNG. So what that means is if you have a code like before, then PHP will think it's a JPEG file, so it's fine, but Apache will think it's just a file without a type, and it will send it without a content type, or it will guess the type if it has this mod my magic. So this is not safe. Yeah, so file name .jpg will pass the check in PHP, but Apache will serve it without a MIME type, and we have cross-site scripting again. And then I thought, okay, what do other applications think? So I checked a few, and it seems it's wildly different. Like there seems to be no agreement how to handle a file which is called .jpg. So it's basically roughly even, right? If we make a vote from different programming languages and web servers. So you cannot really rely on what it is. And I mean, as you will know that it's very often, if we have something where different applications cannot agree on something, this very often leads to security problems. Internet Explorer. Anyone still using Internet Explorer? Yeah, okay. So you may wonder, okay, this MIME-sniffing all sounds bad, but if the web server sets a file type like text plain, can we manage to convince the browser to still sniff the MIME type? And in Internet Explorer, yes, we can do that. There's been a blog post on that. And actually, Internet Explorer supports displaying emails. Emails can contain HTML. In RFC 822 specified. So if you have file.eml, which will then serve, I don't know what the MIME type there is, but yeah, it will be displayed. And it turns out if you have such an email file and you put an iframe in it, then Internet Explorer will load what's in that iframe, and it will ignore the content type and will do MIME sniffing. This is just kind of a curiosity. This blog post is from 2017, and it still works in the very latest version of Internet Explorer. So, yeah, so because I mean, this is a bug in Internet Explorer. This is, and I'm not really sure if as a web application developer you should defend against this, because there's no real good way to defend against this. Here's a quote from Microsoft on the support status of Internet Explorer, where they say Internet Explorer 11 is the last version of Internet Explorer, and it will continue to receive security updates, compatibility fixes, and technical support. Yeah, I don't think that's true. So I guess it was really hard to find one of these 90s style Internet Explorer GIFs. So if you still use Internet Explorer, you should just stop doing that. And maybe if you have a web page and your developers are complaining that, we have all these polyfills to support Internet Explorer, tell them to stop, just don't support that anymore, to give your users an incentive to switch to a more modern browser. Another thing is you can also specify a MIME type with your file upload. So the browser basically does this. it's kind of obvious that this is user-supplied data and you cannot trust it, right? So if I can just change my browser to send any MIME type I want or use Burp Suite or whatever. But it's possible that you might find web applications that will trust this uploaded MIME type and use that to decide whether a file is safe. The PHP documentation has a specific warning for that here, where it says, yeah, this MIME type is, however, not checked on the PHP side, and therefore don't take this value for granted. The Caddy web server. Anyone using Caddy? A few, yeah. So Caddy is one of these modern, really hip web servers. Quote from the webpage, Caddy is praised by researchers and industry experts for its security defaults and unparalleled usability. Its main features are that it's written in Go, so it's a memory-safe language, and it supports HTTPS by default and automatically can get a certificate from Let's Encrypt for you. So I was very surprised that this modern, new, secure web server also does MIME sniffing by default, and there's also no option to switch it off. I reported this to the main developer from Caddy, and he told me, yeah, they're just using basically a function from Go here. So this is Go's HTTP module. It has a function serve content, and it says, yeah, server content tries to deduce the type from name's file extension, and if that fails, falls back to reading the first block of the content and passing it to detect content type. So it's doing the same thing as this 90s area Apache module. So, yeah. So how can we defend against these attacks? And I mean, a big challenge here is that we kind of have an interaction between many different components. We have a browser, we have a web server, we have an application, and we have an operating system. So, yeah, for browsers, please fix Xcontent IO options nosniff. I don't think what it's currently doing is what people expect it to do. But as I said, I hope Mozilla will fix it, and Microsoft will hopefully deprecate the current edge, and in the future they will just inherit the behavior from Chrome, which is okay. This is a bit more controversial, but I think browsers should make a plan to deprecate MIME sniffing, because this is kind of it's a weird tag that causes weird behavior, and it's basically just to support web servers that don't serve correct content. I know it's hard, we have many compatibility issues, but maybe there could be things like incentivizing that if your site is okay, then maybe you can use some new features or something like that. They've been doing this in other areas. Web servers, please don't do server-side MIME sniffing. It just creates problems. If you run an Apache web server, please disable mod MIME magic. I don't think it serves any useful purpose. Will also slow down your system. For operating system vendors and Linux distributions, consider just adding more file types to the MIME types file. I mean, the more complete it is, the less likely it is that you serve a file without a MIME type. And also, please standardize this. Like, it would be really nice if you just had one centrally maintained MIME types file and everyone's using that, so we can rely on saying, yeah, this file type will be detected with the correct MIME type. For web applications and webmasters, so there's one option that kind of kills all of these vulnerabilities, and that is to use a sandbox domain for uploads. That is, for example, what some big pages do. For example, if you look at GitHub, there's this, I think it's raw GitHub user content or something like that, where you can download all the files from repositories. And that's just a separate domain with no accounts or anything. So if you have cross-site scripting there, it doesn't matter. However, for smaller projects, that's often impractical. Like something like WordPress, you usually have in a hosting environment, configuring a separate domain, it's complicated. So that doesn't always work, but that's kind of the safest option. I recommend always setting xcontent options nosniff. It's not perfect, as I told you, but it still makes your browser behave more sanely. And hopefully in the future it will do what it actually is supposed to do. And if you support any kind of uploads for unusual file types, I don't know if you're some kind of retro forum that shares pictures from 90s graphics programs or something like that, you should consider forcing the MIME type, like configuring your web server that these files are always sent with the correct type. Reject uploads starting with a dot, because then you may run into this issue where web server and application cannot agree whether that's an extension or not. Sorry, can we make this in the question session? Yeah, sorry, I didn't understand what you're saying. So yeah, in summary, MIME sniffing is dangerous and needs to go away. Yeah, that was it. Any questions?
Thank you, Hanno. Let's see, is this on? It's on, good. My voice is slowly dying now. So do we have any questions? We have one in the back. For sure. Let's see. Raise your hand again. Oh, there, yeah.
I was just saying that you should also avoid files starting with a dot, because they might end up being hidden, so the administrator will not be able to see them, and they might not even be backed up between one folder and a backup of that folder that you might want to restore afterwards.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyone else? Yep. At the far end. Could we pass the mic down?
Hi. Thank you. Great talk. My question is that have you explored this behavior on IIS?
Yeah. So IIS, if it cannot determine the file type, it will just not serve the file at all. I'm not sure if this is configurable behavior, but this, at least the default setting seems to be safe. Like if there's a file type it cannot identify, it will just, you cannot download it at all.
Anyone else? Yep.
Wouldn't forcing file downloads work as a good mitigation as well? You could probably still use image tags with things that have forcing downloads.
Okay, I'm not sure about the latter. Yeah, that's true. Like you can set this content disposition header, which will force the browser to download a file. That should also be safe. I'm not sure if, but if you have something where you actually want to use the file, like if you have images, and then you would have to distinguish depending on if it's a file you may want to use in the browser or not. But yeah, if you force a download, that should also prevent it.
Have you looked into whether applications are consistent in using a centrally managed MIME types file? Because I checked, and in Arch Linux there were 22 packages providing a file called mime.types.
Yeah, I mean, so I also learned that on FreeBSD there's no system-wide MIME types file. It seems that some applications have their own and use that. But yeah, it's more inconsistency. So I wish we just had a MIME types project. Yeah.
Is there anything we can do as users to protect ourselves from this, even if we can't do it on the server side?
I mean, I hate to say this, but right now Chrome is safer than Firefox or Edge. I'm using Firefox because I feel a monopoly is not healthy. Yeah. You can ask the Mozilla developers to fix this bug.
Thank you for a great talk. Very interesting. Line of business applications, that's an issue, and old code. But when it comes to Internet Explorer and Edge, I think there is the default value is that it detects and blocks cross-site scripting per default, seems like IE8 or something.
No. What you mean is this cross-site scripting filter, but this is only for reflected cross-site scripting, so this does not apply to uploads. It might prevent attacks like the Acme thing that I showed earlier, but for uploads, this is not relevant.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? One last question? No? Well, okay then. Thank you, Hanno.